Welcome, and thanks for tuning into KBRA Podcasts. We cover topical research discussions, industry commentary, and more. As we continue to expand globally, KBRA Podcast is a go-to source for topical briefings directly from our knowledgeable team members. In today's episode of Muni Spotlight, State Revenue Losses Less Than Feared, Karen Daly, Head of Public Finance here at KBRA, is joined by Paul Kwiatkoski, Managing Director, and Linda Vanderperre, Senior Director. The group compares the actual performance of state revenues to the projections that were prevalent at the outset of the pandemic. Actual performance exceeded projections made in the early months of the pandemic. However, better than expected performance on revenues does not alleviate the myriad budgetary pressures that are still present, and conservative budgetary practices remain critical for states in the uncertain environment that remains. Stay tuned to learn more.
I'm Karen Daly, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our second Spotlight Series podcast, which highlights topics of interest in public finance. There have been so many conflicting articles and forecasts about the effects of the pandemic on state revenues that KBRA thought it would be interesting to examine what has actually transpired over these past 11 months, and also take a look at the performance of New York state revenues in particular. The complete article that this podcast is based on is entitled COVID-19, State Revenue Losses Less Than Feared. It is on KBRA's website and is dated January 26th. Our speakers today are Paul Kwiatkoski, Managing Director, and Linda Vanderperre, Senior Director. Paul, what can you tell us about the revenue forecast we looked at?
Thank you, Karen. As you noted, the pandemic has presented so many economic challenges across so many different sectors and in so many different ways. We thought we'd take a look at the difficulty that states have had forecasting revenues. You'll recall that we did a research piece back in June where we reviewed the estimates of state revenue losses. So what we did this time around is we compared the forecasts were made at that time regarding state revenue collections to the actual results that were realized through the subsequent months. In June, we looked at the study by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that estimated revenue losses through fiscal 2020, which is through June 2020 for most states, and further estimated revenue losses through the subsequent two fiscal years. That's fiscal year 2021 and fiscal 2022. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and I'll refer to them as CBPP from here on in, updated its earlier forecasts towards the end of 2020. So we were very fortunate in being able to compare those two studies. In the first study, in June 2020, the CBPP based its estimates of state revenues on economic forecasts of the Congressional Budget Office, and these forecasts anticipated a much more severe downturn than was actually realized. For example, the CBO forecast the unemployment rate to be 11.5% at year-end 2020, when it actually fell to 6.7% by that time. You'll recall this was quite typical at that time, that many observers saw a more pronounced downturn than actually happened. For example, Goldman Sachs forecast the unemployment rate peaking at 25% when the actual peak was 14.8%. This highlights the difficulties of forecast in such an unprecedented environment. Of course, with these underlying assumptions, state revenues were forecast to perform poorly and drop by $185 billion in fiscal 2020. State revenues are very dependent upon underlying economic conditions. This level of a decline was very substantial. It's equivalent to about 7% of total revenues. In actuality, they fell about $22 billion, or less than 1% of aggregate state revenues. If we continue the comparison to the estimate period out through the next two fiscal years, we see similar downward adjustments to the forecasts of revenue losses. The earlier study estimated total revenue losses of about 11% of state revenues, and the updated analysis saw this decline to about 6% of state revenues, so cut in half, roughly. Comparing these two studies provides a good overall picture of all states in aggregate and the difficulty of forecasting in the challenging environment caused by the pandemic. To look at one case in point, Linda Vanderperre examined the budget forecasts of the state of New York and compared them to actual results and found the same overall pattern that one can see in the aggregate analysis. Linda, why don't you tell us more about what you found?
Thanks, Paul. You're right. New York State provides an example of some of the forecasting challenges you've just described. New York released its fiscal year 21 budget back in April of 2020, less than a month into its fiscal year, and only about a month and a half into the pandemic. At that time, the state's Division of Budget, whose economic forecasting capabilities are highly sophisticated, predicted that US GDP growth would contract by as much as 5.7%. And back in April, when it released the budget, New York State had no assurance of direct federal aid because the CARES Act hadn't yet passed. But with the gradual reopening of the state and the national economy from June through the third quarter of 2020, the Division of Budget improved its US GDP forecast, and by October was predicting a much less severe decline of 3.6%. It appears that the combination of the first CARES fiscal stimulus and the gradual reopenings of the economy allowed certain of New York State's primary revenues, in personal income taxes, sales taxes, and business taxes, to slightly outperform the Division of Budget's conservative projections for the first 9 months of the state's 2021 fiscal year, that being the period from April through December of 2020. And when you factor in federal receipts, New York State's total revenues over this 9-month period were actually about $12 billion higher than forecast in the April budget, and more than $13 billion higher than actual results for the year-over-year period. Now, that being said, favorable performance to budget does not take away from the ongoing fiscal challenges that face New York State. Personal income tax and sales tax collections, while outperforming the April budget, are still trending below prior year-over-year levels. Personal income tax revenues are down about 1.4% year-over-year through December, and sales tax revenues have declined more precipitously by about 12.5%. And although revenue performance has been better than expected, growing costs due to pandemic-related unemployment benefits, expanding Medicaid rolls, and provisions for health-related services are expected to continue budgetary pressures for New York as well as many other states. So as we progress to hopefully the next stages of recovery, KBRA will continue to monitor the degree to which unanticipated expenditures are covered by further stimulus packages and the extent to which additional federal funding relieves pressure on state governments.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Again, the full article on this topic can be found on kbra.com.
This concludes our episode. Please continue the conversation on LinkedIn and Twitter @CrowBondRating. We'd also like to remind you that all of our ratings and research reports are free at kbra.com. Lastly, please share your ideas for future podcast episodes or any feedback to media@kbra.com. We hope to see you next time.